This is Mr. Seymour, and this is going to be Chapter 12. And in this, we are going to be looking at the presidency. So this is the first of two chapters on the executive branch of the United States government. And of course, most of our focus with regard to United States government tends to go, rather than to lawmakers, it tends to be on the presidency. At least that's what we as lay people tend to look at. It should be on the focus should be on the legislature, but it tends to be that we look to the president. He is the end-all be-all for our government. He is the representative, the head of state in the United States. So our chapter here is a rather lengthy one. We're going to look at presidents' qualifications and exactly what has made presidents unique. We're going to look at the powers of the president. We're going to look at the chief executive position of the president, how he runs the government. We're going to look at how the president works with Congress and how he has to share power. We're going to look at the president and his national security policy, which includes defense. We're going to look at the public presidency, how the power comes to the president from the people, and, if necessary, how the people can remove the power from the presidency. We're also going to look at the relationship between the president and the press, and we're going to look a little bit about the American presidency and how the American presidency as a head of state is unique. And then we'll do a little bit of summary after we've completed these sections. So, with regard to presidents, one of the first things we want to look at is what kind of expectations we place on a president, who actually gets the job of president, and how they got to that job. So sometimes meeting or matching the expectations of the public with the actual realities of who the president is and how he became president are very different topics, and we need to look at all three of those things. Americans are of two very different minds about the presidency. For one thing, we want to believe in a powerful president who can do good and who somehow will work like Atlas and carry the entire world on his shoulders. But on the other hand, we want to believe that the concentration of power should be with the people, not with the president. So we don't want to give him a lot of power. How we expect him to lift the entire world on his shoulders without any power is the dichotomous relationship that we have about the expectations we put on the presidency. The Constitution says that the president has to be a natural-born citizen, at least 35 years old, and has to be residing in the United States for at least 14 years. All the presidents have been white, male, with the exception of Barack Obama, who is African American, and John Kennedy was not Protestant but Catholic, and he's the only non-Protestant president that we have had. So they've all been white, they've all been male, most of them have been Protestant, with the exception of Obama, all of them have been white. And this is a list of recent presidents, starting with Dwight Eisenhower in 1953 and going all the way to Barack Obama in 2008. He took office in 2009. And if you look, there are let me find my thing here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Republican presidents, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Democratic presidents in the last 50 years or so, which is very interesting because it's a 50-50 split. And usually what happens is we don't like any one of the two parties to gain too much control over the presidency for too long. We tend to be very fickle in our choices. This is a very famous picture of President Johnson. This is, here he is at his desk, basically overwrought with sorrow at the fact that he had not accomplished what he set out to do in becoming President of the United States. His presidency was characterized by a willingness to go after a broad range of issues, everything from communism in Vietnam to poverty in America. And the problem was that he attacked so much so quickly that none of it worked. He had what's called a guns and butter policy. And on one side you had the guns, which was national defense. And on the other side you had the butter, which was domestic. We'll try this again. Domestic. And it's very difficult to balance guns and defense, which would be Vietnam, with butter, your domestic policies, which would be things like the Voting Rights Act, civil rights, and welfare. And that's part of the problem. So winning elections is the typical road to the White House. Once you're elected, the president serves a term of 4 years. The 22nd Amendment limits the number of terms to 2. 35 of 44 presidents have been elected to office, but 9 have not. Also, a president can serve basically up to 10 years because you can serve 2 years of an unfilled term from a previous president if you were, for instance, if you got the job as being vice president and you served out the 2 years of that particular president that for whatever reason left, and then you can have 2 elected terms of your own. So 10 years is the maximum, not 8 like you would think. Now, the rules of succession: the vice president succeeds if the president leaves office. There have been 9 presidents that have done this due to death, resignation, or removal. No president has been removed. 1 president resigned, and unfortunately 8 presidents have died in office. 25th Amendment: the vice president becomes the acting president if the vice president and the president's cabinet determine that the president is disabled. And the impeachment is an accusation placed against the president to have him removed after a majority vote in the House. So the impeachment happens in the House, but he has to be convicted in the Senate. So the charges can be brought for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And an impeached president is then tried by the Senate. 2 presidents have been impeached, but neither has been convicted. One of those presidents has been the president after Lincoln, which was Johnson, Andrew Johnson. And then the other was William Jefferson, Bill Clinton, he was also impeached, but not actually convicted. So no president has actually been removed from office by impeachment. 2 presidents have actually been impeached, though. They're 2 different processes. Richard Nixon is the only American president ever to resign the office. He decided to resign rather than to face the idea of impeachment for his role in Watergate and a series of illegal wiretaps, break-ins, cover-ups, and basically dirty tricks. The thing is that the congressional leaders, both in the House and the Senate, came to him and said the night before he was going to, they were going to vote for impeachment, you will not succeed. They will remove you from office. So you might as well resign now and save the United States a very painful process. The powers of the president. There are constitutional powers. Then there are expansion powers, which have been given to the president by Congress, or presidents have basically given to themselves. And then we need to look at different perspectives on the power of the president. Remember, it's a dichotomous situation. We want strong presidents, especially in times of conflict, but at the same time, we don't want presidents with too much power. We want to make sure that the public has at least the feeling that they're in charge. National security powers. The president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He makes treaties with other nations with 2/3 of the Senate approval. He can nominate ambassadors with majority Senate approval, and he receives ambassadors of other nations. He gives diplomatic recognition to other governments simply by receiving them, and these are very important powers. His legislative powers. He gives the State of the Union address. He convenes both houses of Congress in special sessions, and he can do that. He can adjourn Congress if both houses cannot agree to be adjourned. He can veto legislation, but his veto can be overridden with a 2/3 vote of each house. His administrative powers are the powers that he takes on in order to, as his oath of office says, to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Appoint officials as provided by Congress with a majority Senate approval. He can appoint, but the Senate has to approve. He can request written opinions of administrative officials. He can fill administrative vacancies during congressional recesses. His judicial powers include the power to reprieve and pardon for federal offenses, except for an impeachment. He can appoint federal judges with the agreement of a majority of the Senate. So these are an overview in Table 12.2 of your book of the powers that are given to the president. And they are in the area of national security, legislative, administrative, and judicial. National security, then, is his powers to serve as commander-in-chief, to make treaties, to nominate ambassadors, and to receive ambassadors, and to recognize countries. His legislative powers include the power to present information on the State of the Union to Congress, to recommend legislation to Congress, to convene both houses, to adjourn Congress, and to veto legislation. His administrative powers are to take the care that the laws be faithfully executed, to nominate officials, to request written opinions of administrative officials, and to fill administrative vacancies. His judicial powers include the power to grant reprieves and pardons and to nominate federal judges, who then have to be confirmed. Now, the role of the president has definitely changed as America has increased in prominence on the world stage, and technology has helped to reshape the president, because now the president has, as they call it, the football, or basically the nuclear launch keys. So the president is always one button push away from a decision that could impact the entire world. Presidents themselves have taken the initiative to develop new roles for their office, and so as the office has expanded, the powers of the president have expanded as well. During the 1950s and the 1960s, people wanted a powerful president. By the 1970s, after the Richard Nixon debacle, presidential power was checked and it was distrusted by the government. So, the chief executive powers. Presidents reside over the administration of government, over the executive branch. Today, the federal bureaucracy spends about $3 trillion a year and numbers more than 4 million employees. The presidents appoint about 500 high-level positions and 2,500 lesser jobs, and these are included in something called the Plum Book. The Plum Book, which are the jobs that are appointed by the president and approved by Congress. So now we're going to look at the chief executive position, the vice president, the cabinet, the executive offices, the White House staff, and the First Lady. These are all part of the executive branch. The vice president, constitutionally, they are assigned the minor task of presiding over the Senate and voting in case of a tie. But recent presidents have involved their vice presidents in policy discussions and important diplomacy, and they've taken a much broader, more important role as time goes on. The cabinet is the group of presidential advisors that are not mentioned in the Constitution, but every president, starting with George Washington, has had one. The cabinet is composed of 14 secretaries and the Attorney General of the United States. These are the heads of all of the executive departments, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. So these are the executive departments: the Department of State, the Department of the Treasury, the Department of Defense, Justice, Interior, Agriculture, Commerce, Labor, Department of Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, Transportation, Energy, Education, Veterans Affairs, and Homeland Security. The executive office of the president was started in 1939 when Franklin Roosevelt would establish it. It made up several policy-making and advisory bodies. Three major policy-making bodies that are included here are going to be let me get my highlighter out here. The National Security Council, Council of Economic Advisors, and the Office of Management and Budget. Now, these are all designed to serve the president under his executive authority. So this is basically an overview of the executive branch under the executive office of the president. Of course, the president is the one in charge. So you have the office of the vice president over here, and the White House office is over here, and then the president, who has under him the Office of Management and Budget, the Office of the United States Trade Representative, the National Security Council, the Council of Economic Advisors, the Domestic Policy Council, an Office of Administration, the National Drug Control Policy, which is basically the drug czar, the Office of Science and Technology, the Council on Environmental Quality, the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, the National Economic Council, the Economic Recovery Board, and the White House Military Office. Now, all of these are basically established under the executive authority of the president by Congress. The National Security Council is the committee that links the president's foreign and military policy advisors together. So these guys are the ones that make decisions as to how we're going to handle things like threats and wars. Formal members are the president, the vice president, Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and it's managed by the National Security Advisor. The Council of Economic Advisors is a three-member body that's appointed by the President, and they advise the President on economic policy. The Office of Management and Budget is what prepares the budget for the President and advises the President on agencies, proposals, and reviews, and proposed regulations. So this is what helps the President decide what kind of budget he's going to propose. The White House staff includes the chief aides, the staff of the President and the White House, and presidents rely on policy options, analysis, information, and efforts but presidents often will set the tone. Some presidents are very hands-on, some presidents are very hands-off. So they will set the tone and style of the White House. The Kennedy White House was called Camelot, for instance. And if you look at the tone of the Kennedy White House versus the tone of the Nixon White House, it's quite different. So Kennedy was Camelot. Sorry about that, guys. All right. Principal offices in the White House. You have the office of the First Lady and the office of the Vice President. Then you have the office of the President, his Chief of Staff, and his Deputy Chief of Staff. And then you have all of the three branches of what we call the West Wing. The political offices are your legislative, advisory, political, press secretary, speech writing, research, media. Your support offices are basically going to be the kitchen, the maintenance, the records, photography, visitors bureau, executive clerks, correspondence, Secret Service, the medical and military offices, the personnel, and travel. And then, of course, scheduling and appointments. Then the policy office. These are the national security affairs, the policy and economic policy, domestic policy. These are all the czars. These are basically the policy offices that oversee or recommend policy to the president. The First Lady has no official governmental position, but is active in politics. Most will focus on a single issue. Hillary Clinton had health care. Michelle Obama is fighting childhood obesity, supporting military families, helping working women balance career and family, and encouraging national service. She's been very, very strong in the childhood obesity, I think, is the big one for her. So here she is reading basically to some children. If you remember, under President Bush, his wife was Laura was a librarian here in Texas, and so her emphasis was on education. Now, what happens if Bill Clinton becomes first man? How will things change? This is going to be something that's going to be very interesting to consider. Presidential leadership. As chief legislator, he proposes legislation and he establishes a legislative agenda. His party leadership, he is the visible leader of his particular party. Public support and his need for public support, and then his use of legislative skills. The chief legislator power, the main power he has is the veto. Constitutionally, he has the power to send a bill back to Congress with his reasons for rejecting, and then Congress can override with a 2/3 vote. It's very rare, though, that vetoes get overridden. Most are not. A pocket veto is a very special kind of veto that occurs when Congress adjourns within 10 days of sending a bill to the president, and the president will simply let the bill die rather than not signing it. He just puts it in his pocket and lets it die. So these are recent presidents with the number of vetoes that they and regular votes that they had. Now this is done as of 2011, so it's not the latest data. But Eisenhower had 73 vetoes. He had 2 of his vetoes overridden, which is a percentage of 3%. The highest percentage of overriding vetoes was for Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Reagan, and then George W. Bush. George W. Bush had 33% of his vetoes overridden, which was 4 out of 12. Ford had 12 of his vetoes, his 48 vetoes overridden, which is 25%. George W. had, let's see, 4 out of 12, and then Reagan had 9 out of 39. So in terms of party leadership, being in the president's party creates a psychological bond between the legislator and the president, increasing the agreement between the president and his legislators. Slippage in party support means that they can't always count on party support in a controversial issue, and the president is very upset because he'll have all of his votes lined up, and then all of a sudden he'll find that he's had some slippage in his own party, and that really upsets him, which is why you have people like party whips in your in Congress to help make sure that everything's aligned. Party leadership. The president has to work with party leaders in Congress and support party candidates. And then there's a coattail effect. Coattail effect happens when voters cast their ballot for congressional candidates of the president's party because they support the president. So the last time we saw a coattail effect was in 2008 when the president was voted in. If Hillary Clinton were to become president next, who I think is going to be the Democratic nominee, I don't know, then I would expect that she might have a coattail effect. We'll find out, though. So the presidents depend heavily on their party's leaders in Congress. Remember these guys? Here's Nancy Pelosi, the minority leader, Mitch McConnell, and over here is Boehner, majority leader, the Speaker of the House. Presidents depend heavily on these leaders. They must negotiate with leaders of the opposition. Here he is with Steny Hoyer, House Minority Leader John Boehner, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid. I'm sorry, it's Harry Reid. I think I said Mitch McConnell. Okay, congressional gains and losses. You can look and see that you have large gains or losses sometimes when presidents change. And in the Senate, it's not as large, except when Reagan was voted in. Now this is midterms. You'll also find that, if you look here, in most midterm elections, these numbers are negative. Most midterm elections find that when after presidents voted into office, the next election that comes up in 2 years usually sees, after the first term, within the first term of a president, you usually see shifts in ideology among the voters, and they sometimes are disenchanted and they'll vote people out of office. And that's what usually happens in terms of midterm elections. It's rare that we find positive numbers after midterm elections. Public approval. A source of presidential leadership of Congress is public approval. Public approval gives the president leverage, but it doesn't make him in command of the legislators. And it does not guarantee success, but it gives him some bargaining power. If he's got a high approval rating. If he's got a low approval rating, then it's going to hurt him more than help him when it comes to influencing Congress and their vote. A mandate is a perception that the voters strongly support the president's character and policies. Mandates are infrequent, but like every president seems to think that they have one, but they are infrequent. Bargaining is trading support or providing benefits in exchange for votes. The president will make personal appeals and structure congressional votes. He will set priorities among proposals, and he will exploit what is called his honeymoon period. A honeymoon period is in the first 18 months after a president is elected. He usually can get just about anything accomplished. After that, it's much, much harder, particularly the closer he gets to ending his last term in office, which is his lame duck period. So here is President Clinton finding roles of legislative leader challenging. Often he must compromise with opponents in Congress, as President Clinton did in 1996 when he signed the Welfare Reform Act. He had to sign off on a lot of other changes in order to get that act approved, like workfare. So now we're going to look at the national security policy roles. the president's role as chief diplomat, as commander-in-chief, the War Powers Act, crisis manager, and working with Congress. Chief diplomat role is that he negotiates treaties with other countries, and he gets those treaties approved with a 2/3 Senate vote. He uses executive agreements. He can use executive agreements to take care of routine matters with other countries, which are not treaties and don't have to be approved by the Congress. He can negotiate for peace between other countries, as was done, for instance, between Egypt and Israel by President Carter back in the 1970s. Presidents usually will conduct diplomatic relations through envoys, but occasionally they engage in personal diplomacy where, for instance, President Carter brought Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat into Camp David and had them talk. And they walked away with agreements that actually ended decades and even more of war between Egypt and Israel. His role as commander-in-chief, the writers of the Constitution wanted civilian control of the military, so he does serve as civilian commander of the military. Presidents often make important military decisions and command a standing military and nuclear arsenal with their finger on the War Powers Act, or the War Powers Resolution, is a law that was passed in 1973 that, due to fighting in Vietnam and Cambodia, it requires presidents to consult with Congress whenever possible prior to using military force, and to withdraw force after 60 days unless Congress can declare war or grant an extension. We have not declared war in a very long time, so it's congressional extensions that have kept us in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, as crisis manager, these are sudden, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous events that require the president to play the role, and this usually will improve his approval ratings as well. So an example would be the role after 9/11 that President Bush played. In working with Congress, the president has the lead role in foreign affairs. He has the lead role in foreign affairs, but he still has to work with Congress for support and funding for his foreign policies. So here is President Bush famously saying, "I hear you, and the people that took down these buildings will soon hear you." And this can be the most difficult part of his job. It can also be the most rewarding in that it leads to usually higher approval ratings, as what happened with after 9/11 with George W. Bush. So the public presidency and power from the people. When the president goes public and delivers an address to the people or shares with the people his expectations, this makes a difference. Presidential approval, public policy support, and mobilization. When going public, public support is the president's greatest source of influence. The presidential appearances that he has are very staged to get the public's attention. As head of state, he will often perform ceremonial functions which can usually result in favorable press coverage, whether it's showing up at a funeral or laying a wreath on the tomb of the unknown soldier, or opening Congress, or whatever. So here's John Kennedy, who was the first president to use the public appearances regularly to seek popular backing for his policies. Despite his popularity and skills as a communicator, he was often frustrated with his attempts to get support for his such things as his New Frontier policies, man on the moon policy, for instance. We will put a man on the moon by the end of this decade. Presidential approval, the product of many factors such as predispositions, honeymoon period, policy decisions, positions, rallying events, and job-related personal characteristics. The approval rating usually goes down over time. The closer that the president becomes to becoming a lame duck, the less the approval rating is. And approval ratings go up after a major event, particularly one that is unifying in terms of bringing the country together. So these are presidential approval ratings, and as you can see, they usually start high and end low. Clinton started low and ended high, even after he was impeached, which was right in here. He was impeached. Okay, but he still ended high. George W. Bush started high after 9/11 and ended low. Obama is starting high and ending low. Also, you have generation gaps in presidential approvals. For instance, with Obama, those under 30 had high approval ratings, while those over 65 had low approval ratings, whereas with Bush it was the opposite. Those under 30 had very low approval ratings. Those over 65 had very high approval ratings. Presidents frequently attempt to obtain public policy support with television or radio appearances and speeches to large groups. This is called what Teddy Roosevelt called his bully pulpit. His bully pulpit. Presidents want the public to communicate its views directly to Congress, and so they'll mobilize and say, call your congressman. But the bully pulpit is over here. It's the ability of the president to directly speak to the people to get public support for his policies. And the bully pulpit is a term that is actually originated after Teddy Roosevelt, who had the tendency to say bully every time he wanted something done. As far as the press is concerned, they are policy advocates who want to control the amount and timing of information about their administration, and they use the press very skillfully. The press wants all the information that exists without delay, and so to get access to the president, they will utilize the press. They will offer them specialized access if the press will cover things in the way they want them covered. So basically the press ends up being manipulated, and then to an extent we are manipulated by the press in exchange. The job of the press secretary is somebody who serves as a conduit of information from the White House to the press. They conduct daily press briefings, they arrange private interviews, photo opportunities, and travel arrangements for the reporters. The direct interaction between the president and the press is the press conference. And to be invited in a press conference and called on a press conference, generally you have to be doing something right. If you're not, and you're not covering the president the way he wants to be covered, he will not acknowledge you. The body watch. Reporters focus on president's personal and official activities, and they provide the public with step-by-step accounts. So they watch where the president. Today, the president is giving a speech at. That would be the body watch. Then bias. News coverage of the presidency often tends to emphasize the negative because we love the negative. Even if the presentation is seemingly neutral, it generally emphasizes the negative, which has an impact on approval ratings. Bias down. The presidency and democracy, and the presidency and the scope of government. The concerns over the presidency having too much power often are tied to policy concerns. Right now with Obama, we can see that. Others argue that there are too many checks and balances on the president should have more power. There should be a balance of power between how much power the president has and how much he can use. As far as the scope of government, many 20th century presidents have successfully advocated substantial increases in the role of the national government. And presidents since Johnson have championed constraints on government and spending limits, especially in domestic policy. Yet, at the same time, they want to be able to get their policies enacted, which is why we don't have either. All right, so to summarize, Americans have high expectations of their presidents. They've come from relatively wide range of backgrounds. Most presidents are elected by the public, but about 1 in 5 have succeeded to the presidency when the president died or resigned. No president has been removed for a disability as provided under the 25th Amendment, but it also provides the mechanism for filling vacancies in the office of vice president or by conviction of impeachment. Though two presidents have been impeached, none have been removed, which means they were not convicted by the Senate. The Constitution does give presidents the power for national security, legislative and administrative and judicial powers, some of which are quite general. Presidential power has increased through the actions of presidents and because of factors including things like technology and the prominence of the United States as it is increased, and the role of the president as our chief diplomat. One of the president's primary principal responsibilities is to manage the executive branch. The vice president plays a central role in recent administrations, but really was not designed that way under Congress or under the Constitution. Cabinet members focus on running executive departments, so that's your cabinet. But they also play a modest role as a unit together. So when things are really serious, the cabinet will be brought in to talk. The executive office includes the Council of Economic Advisors, the National Security Council, which organizes the security decision-making process, and the Office of Management and Budget. So the executive office is the Council of Economic Advisors, National Security Council, and Office of Management and Budget, which prepares the budget and evaluates regulations and legislative proposals. The presidents rely heavily on the White House staff for information, policy options, and analysis, but the First Lady has no official position. She may play an important role in advocating for a particular issue. And then we get our legislative powers or shared powers. Veto power and party leader power. Veto power is the powerful tool for stopping legislation. Party leader power helps to get a winning legislative coalition behind his proposals, but the party members sometimes oppose the president, so it has to be shared. The president makes frequently has to face oppositions in Congress, and he rarely enjoys electoral mandates for his policy, but they can benefit from high levels of public approval. It's all about public approval ratings. But remember, they go down over time. Presidential leadership of Congress and politics of shared powers. The variety of presidential legislative skills, ranging from bargaining to setting priorities, contributing only marginally to the president's success with Congress. Really, Congress is its own animal. The president is the chief diplomat. He's the commander-in-chief and the crisis manager. Presidents have substantial formal and informal powers regarding going to war, and these remain a matter of controversy like the war powers. Okay. Congress has a central constitutional role in making national security policy, but leadership in this area is centered in the White House, and presidents usually get support from Congress when we're in a crisis. Presidents will invest in efforts to win the public's approval, but they have often they have low approval levels. Approval levels are affected by party identification, by evaluations of his performance on policy areas, and evaluations of the president's character and job-related skills. They usually go down over time. Presidents typically fail to obtain the public's support for their policy initiatives and rarely are able to mobilize the public to act on behalf of these initiatives. Generally, we make up our own minds. The press is the principal intermediary between the president and the public, and the way that the president can directly interact with the press is through the press conference. So presidents and the press are frequently in conflict over the amount, nature, and tone of the coverage of the presidency. Much of the coverage of the president is superficial, covering the body count. The body count, which is where is he today? Okay? But there has been an increase in the negativity of coverage, and there is an increasing number of ideologically biased sources of news. If you watch Fox News right now, you're going to see a lot of anti-Obama rhetoric. If you watch CNN or MSNBC, you'll probably see more positive rhetoric. Whereas if you had watched Fox News a few years ago, you would have seen a lot of negative or positive rhetoric towards Bush and negative rhetoric towards Obama as they were running against, as Obama was running for president against John McCain. Understanding the American presidency, the fear of presidential power is harmful to democracy is always present, but there are many checks on presidential power. Supporting of increasing the scope of government is not inherent in the presidency, and presidents have frequently been advocates of limiting government growth. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of this chapter. So I will see you for chapter 13, which is on the executive branch.